This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace.
Imposter syndrome. It's something all of us seem to struggle with somewhere on our journeys. In fact, I do a lot of podcast interviews, and when audience questions come in, one of them will often be, when can I legitimately call myself a photographer? And when I travel around, I speak to a lot of photographers, especially those just starting out, and I can hear those unspoken questions under the surface of what they're saying to me. Things like, but I just make so many mistakes, so if I put my work out into the world, am I just embarrassing myself? Or I know how much I don't know and how much there still is to learn, so am I going to be caught out for my knowledge gaps? Or when I look around, it just seems to be so easy for everybody else. So the fact that it's a struggle for me, does that actually mean that I have no talent? All this is just imposter syndrome at work. And I think the question underneath all of it for all of us is, do I really belong here? So in this video, I want to unpack what I really think imposter syndrome is, the different guises it comes to us in, and some of the things that have helped me to get over imposter syndrome over the years. And I hope that this will be relevant not just to the photographers amongst you, but artists of any sort, no matter what you make. So we should probably begin by defining exactly what we mean when we talk about imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is a fear-based psychological state. And we know it's set in when we experience persistent doubts over our abilities and we continually downplay our accomplishments. No matter what the facts are, we feel like a fraud. I actually think that there are a number of different flavors to imposter syndrome, and each of them is driven by a very particular fear. So let's explore a few. The first is perfectionism and the fear that our work isn't good enough. We tell ourselves that anything less than perfect is a failure, and any mistakes that we make lead to intense self-criticism. And we know that when that sort of mindset sets in, we just want to give up altogether and walk away from photography or whatever art we're engaged in, which I think is a tragedy, because I think good is often good enough. The second is insecurity, and it's driven by this fear that everybody else out there has some vital piece of information that we're missing. We feel like we have to know everything there is to know about photography before we get to call ourselves photographers. And we have this deep insecurity that if we don't have all the answers, then surely we're not competent. But the fact is, we don't know what we don't know. And so most of us sit there with this fear that we're going to be exposed and shamed for our knowledge gaps. The third is struggle, and it's driven by this fear that we have that if we're truly talented, surely things should be easier than they are. Maybe we feel that we're having to work really hard just to get anywhere, and we have this false assumption that everybody else out there is finding this stuff so easy. We have this idea that surely we should just be able to excel at this if we're truly gifted at it, and that when things get difficult, we feel like perhaps I'm a fraud who has no real talent. And the fourth is isolation, which is driven by this fear that we're going to be seen or exposed and all our mistakes are going to be laid bare. In this case, we end up trying to do it all on our own because somehow it feels safer or more controllable. If I'm honest, this has been my particular downfall, and in the past I've tried to avoid all that exposure. But I've also learned that when I try and do it all myself in that little bubble, or I resist asking for help when I need it, that's a surefire breeding ground for more insecurity. But no matter what particular flavor of imposter syndrome strikes, we know how it feels, that we're tempted to run away and just pack everything in, that we lose self-confidence, that fear sets into our thinking process, and that inspiration just seems to leave us, so we have to get a handle on it. So I have a few suggestions for how you can battle imposter syndrome when it comes around, and these are things that have helped me over the years. And again, this isn't just for photographers. I hope this is applicable to you if you're a writer or a filmmaker or a musician or an artist of any sort. My first suggestion would be to own the feeling. Start by admitting how you feel. Look it in the face. I mean, the fact is that we all feel insecure about our journeys from time to time. I mean, I've been doing this for more than 15 years now, and I still have days where I don't feel like I'm on the right track or I'm falling behind everybody else. You're not special. In fact, those feelings probably just mean that you're very normal. I think about it like when you start a new job. I mean, I've joined a couple of big companies in my career, and I know when I go in those first few weeks, I often feel like I'm just the idiot who knows nothing and is making all the mistakes, and everyone else just seems to be really brilliant at their jobs. But after a few months, you start to realize that lots of other people, even those who've been there for a long time, they struggle with insecurities. And when you look around, you realize that a lot of people are faking their levels of competence. We're all in the same boat. And when you start by acknowledging to yourself that those feelings of insecurity that you sometimes have to battle, everyone else deals with them too, then you can begin by going, okay, that just means I'm human and normal, and you don't have to think of yourself as somehow broken or defective for feeling that way. Remember that it's just a feeling, and feelings aren't facts. Don't get stuck at the feeling and allow it to rob you of your creativity and your drive to develop yourself and move forward. Keep going. As the title of Susan Jeffers' famous book says, feel the fear and do it anyway. My second suggestion would be to get perspective. I have a feeling that a lot of imposter syndrome comes down to us running ahead of ourselves and comparing ourselves to the wrong things. I know a lot of us begin in photography and immediately, even from year one, start comparing ourselves to great photographers who've been at it for an entire lifetime. But there's no point in making ourselves feel bad and incompetent because we're trying to compare ourselves to photographers or artists who've been at it a lot longer than we have. Today you're as good as you are. You can't get around that. But there's always tomorrow, and the whole thing is a journey. The trick is to have an honest and sober view of where you're actually at. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I've been at this for 15 plus years as a professional photographer. And I know that I have a wide set of skills. I can cross a lot of different genres. I've worked in a lot of different areas, which makes me a competent photographer and a pretty good teacher. But I know I'm not the best at anything by a long shot. I am a middling photographer in most genres, and I'm fine with that. If I know where I'm actually at and I'm willing to be honest about it, then I'm not a pretender to something that I don't have, and so I don't have to deal with imposter syndrome. So I think having a sober view of where we're actually at diffuses a lot of those feelings. My third suggestion is to celebrate growth. If you find imposter syndrome setting in, then it's time to stop focusing on what you're not yet and start celebrating how far you've actually come. Shift your focus to the journey you've taken so far and take a moment to pat yourself on the back for how much better your work has gotten along the way. Because we should all be looking for growth over perfection anyway, and we shouldn't be so afraid of mistakes because we all know that we only learn by making one mistake at a time and getting better day by day. If we think about it this way more often, then we won't have those same fears about being caught out for our knowledge gaps or being seen to make mistakes because we're taking a longer view of things. And any fellow photographers or artists who would actually seek to shame us for making those mistakes we all have to make to get better, they're just playing an ugly ego game and they can safely be ignored. My fourth suggestion, and this is probably the most important one, is to get connected. I know it's tough to find genuine creative connections and community around our work, but for our own sake, we have to stop cutting ourselves off and isolating ourselves when we feel insecure. You see, I think imposter syndrome only really works in isolation. The minute we share our feelings and our insecurities with our family and our friends and those who genuinely care about us, the reflections they give us back will often just serve to drive those feelings away. If you're willing to hear it, their honest and more factual interpretation of what they see going on from the outside is probably to be trusted more than our emotionally charged inner insecurities that are bubbling away under the surface and sapping our motivation. So invest in creative friendships, choose to open up with your family, find yourself a mentor, or even book in a few sessions with a therapist so you can get that better perspective of where you're actually at and drive away some of that self-doubt. But here's what I imagine you really need to hear if you're sitting there genuinely battling with imposter syndrome. You belong. So I'm telling you, as you're sitting there and as you're watching me on this screen, I'm saying to you, you belong here. If you take photographs, you have the right to call yourself a photographer like anybody else. Ignore the gatekeepers, they're just speaking out of their own uncalibrated egos and their personal fears. Don't let them put you down or bully you. The fact is, you have as much right to make images and add to this art form as anybody else does. You don't have to know everything, because none of us do. You don't have to be making millions off your work, because some of the best artists in history made very little money from their art in their lifetimes. And you don't have to be the very best at something to have something important to tell us with your work. You're enough as you are. Just remember to grow at your own pace and be kind to yourself. Enjoy the process and know that you belong. Just before I go, I want to remind you about my Parable magazine, which is now available. There are 4 editions available. Each one has writing and photography on a theme. They'll come out twice a year. Physical copies will be available while stocks last, but there's also digital versions available, which are PDF downloads and an MP3 audio file of me reading the magazine to you. And lastly, thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this episode. If you need a website or a domain, they're a fantastic option. I've used them myself for over a decade now. The reason I went with Squarespace long before they were a sponsor on this channel was because I wanted a website where my images did the talking and the design was quite minimal and put out of the way. One of the things I've learned over the years is that when it comes to design, minimalism looks very easy to do, but it's quite hard to actually do it well. And that's why I like Squarespace, because they have a whole host of templates put together by professional designers, which are very, very easy to use. I can click and drag in image blocks and galleries and videos and text and even put a store together. And the design doesn't get in the way and it lets my work do the talking.
Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.